Corvin was not born to holiness. Once he had been a tanner's boy, his hands stained with lye and hide, his breath thick with the musk of carrion. But fate, or perhaps punishment, carried him into darker labors. When plague thinned the village, and priests no longer dared tread among the dying, Corvin took to burying the dead. His strength became his sanctity, his silence, his prayers. Now he was the Gravewarden of Wyrmford, a town whose crooked roofs leaned toward the swollen river like penitents bent in confession. Each day he turned soil for another soul, and each night he walked home with mud and grief clinging to his boots. The villagers muttered that he was touched by the grave, that his black eyes had stared too long into death's hollow sockets, yet they depended on him. For in those days, the earth was heavy with rot, and someone must always stand between the restless dead and the fragile living. And so he dug. He dug with ritual, with rhythm, with the weary devotion of a man condemned to endless toil. The sound of spade biting earth was his only litany, the tolling of funeral bells his only psalm. Lady Elswith watched him from afar. Her husband, Sir Osric of the Burning Thorn, had been laid beneath Corvin's soil scarcely a fortnight past. Once a knight of renown, Osric had returned from war broken, his flesh pocked with scars, his mind haunted by enemies only he could see. Fever had taken him at last, leaving his lady with neither heir nor coin. Elswith, pale as milk and draped always in mourning black, sent for Corvin under the pretense of prayers for her husband's soul. Yet when he came, no prayers were spoken. At first it was wine by candlelight, then a touch of her hand upon his wrist, then lips, soft, desperate, forbidden. Corvin told himself it was mercy, that he only sought to soothe her loneliness, but when he left her chamber before dawn, the sheets still warm with their sin, he knew well enough that it was desire. And still he returned, for Elswith's whispers kept him from the cold, and in her eyes he found a tenderness the graveyard could never yield. Yet each time he laid beside her, Sir Osric's memory loomed like a corpse, unquiet. It was on a night without moon that the soil first groaned. Corvin worked low, lantern dim, against the fog. The air stank of drowned earth, the kind of smell that seeps through the skin and never departs. He had come to mend a grave where the ground had caved, a simple task. But as he set his spade into the mound, the earth trembled beneath his boots. At first, he thought it a mole or root shifting. Yet the movement grew violent, soil rising, splitting like a wound. His lantern swung wild arcs, shadows leaping among the stones. Then, a hand broke through. Bone, slick with grave water, clawed upward and gripped the roots of a cross. Another hand followed, then a skull, its grin too wide. The grave itself vomited forth a giant of bone, armor clinging to its frame in rusted fragments. Corvin stumbled back, the shovel shaking in his grip. For on the knight's shattered breastplate, dim beneath moss and rust, he saw the sigil of the Burning Thorn. Osric. The name escaped him in a hoarse whisper. The skeleton rose in silence, joints cracking like oaks in winter. Its sockets burned with a faint ember, not fire, but something older, colder, as if hatred itself gave it form. Corvin swung his spade. Sparks flew where steel struck bone, but the creature lurched forward, unfaltering. Its jaw hung slack, and yet Corvin heard words inside his skull, words rasped through marrow and guilt alike. You took what was mine. His breath failed him. Every strike he made only drew the knight closer. Every step back dragged him deeper into the labyrinth of stones. The graves themselves seemed to lean, as though the dead wished to watch. And then came the memory, crueler than any blade, Ellsworth's lips, warm and trembling against his. Her sigh, whispering his name in the bed that was not his to share. The graveyard rang with the clash of spade on bone. Corvin fought like a beast cornered, yet the skeleton drove him against the oldest crypt, its doors sealed with moss and forgotten prayers. Lightning split the sky, throwing the horror into stark relief. The towering frame, the fragments of armor, the skeletal hand reaching not only for his flesh, but for judgment. Ellsworth is mine, the voice groaned within him, and so is your soul. Corvin fled. He leapt tombs, stumbled over headstones, the night filled with his ragged breath, yet always he heard the scrape of bone upon stone behind him, relentless, patient as the grave itself. He burst into Ellsworth's manor before dawn, mud and blood clinging to him. She rose from her bed, eyes wide in horror as he gasped out the tale. Her hands trembled, yet her face hardened like frost upon stone. "It cannot be," she whispered. "He swore he would never leave me, not in life, not in death." And then Corvin understood. She had known, she had always known. For in her grief, she had prayed not to God, but to darker powers, that her night might guard her still. And now the prayer had been answered, vengeance awakened in bone and shadow. The doors of the manor thundered. Splinters rained as skeletal hands tore through oak. The night entered, looming, silent save for the rattle of ancient mail. Ellsworth stepped forward, arms outstretched. "My husband, you have returned." The skeleton's gaze did not falter. Its hollow eyes passed through her, fixed instead upon Corvin. He fell to his knees, spade clattering to the stone floor. His voice cracked, begging for mercy, for forgiveness, for anything but the cold grip of judgment. Yet none came. The last thing he saw was Ellsworth's pale face, torn between terror and devotion, as the skeleton's hand closed over him and dragged him screaming into the dark. The manor was still. The doors hung broken, the floor smeared with mud and silence. Ellsworth sank to her knees. Her arms remained outstretched where her husband had passed, as though frozen in a prayer half spoken. Her lips moved, but no sound followed. Whether in devotion or in despair, none could say. She rose, her face pale as carved stone. She did not weep. She did not call after them. She only gathered her cloak about her shoulders, turned from the shattered hall, and shut herself away. No record tells what words she whispered in that silence, nor to whom her prayers were offered, but the candles in the manor burned down to stubs, and she was seen no more in the streets of Wyrmford.